Welcome to Grantwood AEA's Blended and Personalized Learning Teams webinar about students as self-directed learners, which is one of our tenets of blended and personalized learning. As a reminder, blended and personalized classrooms have learners who feel safe, valued, and recognized, who understand what they are learning and why they are learning it, and who experience learning that meets their needs and who are invested and engaged learners. Our webinar today is going to focus, as I said, around the tenet of student as self-directed learners, which yield highly invested and engaged learners. I am going to kick it on over to my teammate, Mindy Carney, to really get us thinking about what that means when we think about our students.
Yeah, well, students as self-directed learners isn't something that's just going to happen in a day, as much as we'd love to sprinkle our fairy dust on top of that. We often hear that students, as they grow, become more stagnant in their curiosity and their desire to investigate new ideas. So how can we bring back the wonder of learning for our students and ask them to take ownership too? During this first phase in the personalized alignment tool, we begin to investigate the characteristics of highly invested and engaged learners. These students are engaged in goal setting and reflection, and also beginning to develop the foundational skills for student metacognition by providing the teacher feedback around the learning experiences. To be honest, students may be a bit unwilling or opposed to this if they have become apathetic in their learning. Therefore, in this first phase, we're going to begin looking at practices in this tenet with the lens around learner dispositions as opposed to academic achievement. And I think Beth is going to talk a little bit about these practices.
Yeah, so there are three practices in this tenet. And I would say the first two fit together sort of like opposite sides of a coin. The first one is student goal setting that is part of the learning process. And the second one is that students reflect on their learning. So building those two practices into the culture of the classroom begins to chip away at what Mindy described as the apathy of learning, creating a structure where students can set a goal and then have time to reflect on their progress toward that goal helps to shift the understanding that learning is something that they are a part of. Instead, it's not something that's done to them, it's something that's done with them as they are taking part in the learning process. The third practice then is that students have the opportunity to provide the teacher with input and feedback on learning experiences. This builds on the understanding that learning is a partnership, and part of school is figuring out how they, the individual student, learns the best. This practice gives the students the opportunity to take a step back and think about the learning experiences as a process, not just about the content that is tested and assessed in different ways. So we want to dig deeper into these practices. We're going to start with the first one. Student goal setting is part of the learning process.
And as we think about goal setting, it really is kind of that first phase in getting students to self-direct their learning and focus on a mindset of growth. As we set a goal, we see if we can make it there. And it really personalizes the learning process because it's based on the students' needs that they have self-identified, which begins to kind of start to shift that responsibility to your students. And with that, students create their own intention that's going to be personal to them, which will motivate them and empower them in a very different way as the teacher set the goal in that process. And so as a teacher, we really need to think about how we can model and how we can set up systems to put this into play and to make this be a living, breathing part of your classroom environment. So as we think about that system, we need to make it visible, make those goals visible. How can we revisit it and how can we reflect on it? And, as we start with that visibility thing, that's kind of probably where the wheels fall off of this for a lot of teachers. Goals can easily be set and easily be forgotten about. So we need to figure out ways to put that goal in front of students to make it a natural part of their learning environment. For younger students, it could be a post-it note on their desk. For older students, it could be part of a reflection sheet they revisit on a weekly basis. Revisiting needs to be an important piece of that puzzle. Having it visible and in front of them will help them to do it naturally, but we also need to carve out some time for that revisiting piece to help encourage that self-advocacy of students in the process to say, I'm not anywhere close to meeting these goals, so how can I step forward to be a part of that? And during the goal writing, the students will start to see this as it becomes more part of your class. You may want to consider and think about the types of goals and how that might change over time as this becomes a bigger part of your classroom. You may encourage students to start with behaviors, because that can be something very easy for them to identify. And then as you transition to thinking more about academic goals, perhaps starting with processes, like how are they working within this, to evolving to skills. How am I meeting these things that we are working on? And as we think about not only that, but layer on top of it, starting with short-term goals. Our students have a variety of different attention spans, and so starting with short-term goals will have more success in your classroom as you work to evolve to longer-term goals. And as we think about all of those layers and the structures, I'm going to turn it over to Gina Rogers to talk about perhaps a strategy to use to provide your students some structures within the goal setting.
So one strategy that you might use to support your students in goal setting is to utilize the WHOOP strategy. So WHOOP is a lot like, or kind of similar to a SMART goal, which I feel like a lot of us have been SMART goaled to death. But it's a little bit more focused on identifying what obstacles might possibly come up as you are trying to make progress towards the goal that you have set for yourself, and then anticipating what those obstacles would be and setting a plan of action in order to right the course when an obstacle does arise. And so WHOOP stands for a wish. So what is it that you really want? What would be the best possible outcome if that wish came true, or if that wish came to fruition? And then what would be an obstacle that might crop up to stop you from achieving that goal or stop you from attaining that outcome? And then what is going to be your plan to try to right the ship if that obstacle does show up? And so an easy way to think about this, maybe, or like a way to think about this that's more real life, is to think about eating habits around the holidays. So my wish is that I don't overindulge. My best possible outcome would be that I get through these holiday seasons without gaining a whole lot of weight from all those cookies. An obstacle that might show up for me is that my neighbors bring cookies every single day in December, which is really tempting. And so my plan might be to eat one and put the rest of them in the freezer, or put them someplace where I don't see them, or find a replacement behavior to engage in to try to not sit down and eat all the cookies. In a more school setting, maybe my wish is that I'm struggling in Algebra 2 really bad, and I just wish that I would pass this Algebra 2 exam. And the best possible outcome that can come from me passing this is, if I pass this, I will pass the class and I will be okay. So obstacle that crops up is that I just have a really hard time completing all this practice work because I've got a really busy schedule, right? And so like after school, I go to soccer practice. After soccer practice, I go to play practice. And so it's hard for me to find this time. And so my plan is that I sit down, I look at my schedule, and I see, oh, I've got a little bit of 20 minutes here in between soccer and play practice. Rather than going to Casey's real quick to get a slushie to recharge myself, I'm going to spend a little bit of time just doing some of that math practice work. Additionally, I'm going to come in during before school and see what I can get done during that time, and also share my goals and my wishes with a friend that's really good at Algebra 2, and just have them take a look at some of my practice work and give me some feedback on that, just because I know that this friend is good and I'm struggling and I need some help. That goes into kind of my second strategy, or the second strategy that we'd like to share with you is a goal is only as good as someone is able to remember it. And so we talked a little bit about making those goals visible, like putting them either someplace on the desk where a student can see them really easily, or inside of a folder where they're reflecting on them constantly and thinking about them. Sometimes it's really easy for me, and I'm sure other people too, to kind of lie to themselves of how much progress they're making towards their goals. And so trying to have an accountability buddy, or maybe an accountability buddy, if you will, is a really good strategy to just make progress towards that goal. So sharing the goal that you have with someone else and talking with them about what are the things that I'm doing to try to make progress towards this. And that person can help me stay honest with myself of whether or not I'm actually trying things, I'm actually making progress, or have I been slacking off on that 20 minutes that I promised myself to work on that math homework and been going to Casey's and getting my slushies instead. So those are just two strategies that you might consider introducing into your classroom to help support students in setting those goals, making those goals visible and living, and that they're actually reflecting on their progress toward their goals on a regular basis.
So Gina, I'm glad you brought up accountability buddies, because I think that really leads into our next practice, which is students reflect on their learning. And you talked a little bit about maybe talking with your accountability buddy and reflecting on where you're at in your plan and how it's coming. And so to kind of really focus on that reflection part, when students first begin reflecting on their learning, they're going to need plenty of modeling. And I know we talk about modeling, and sometimes that sounds like something that you would do with younger students, but modeling means regardless of the age of the student, students will need to hear teachers doing think alouds to help them begin developing their own cognitive awareness. This is not something that will be immediate or automatic for our students. We have to model regardless of the age of our students. So as students become more aware of their thinking processes, they will be more able to choose strategies that help them learn best, and therefore be more planful when goal setting. So when Gina talked about the WHOOP strategy, she talked about students being planful. And as they learn more about how they learn best, those plans will become even more powerful, so that students that are more reflective on their learning and reflective on their goals can begin to take more ownership of their learning. And so Beth, I think you had the opportunity to talk to Chris Klosterman, right?
I did. Chris Klosterman is a colleague of ours. He is a secondary literacy and social studies consultant here at Grant Wood. And Chris and I talked about conferring, which is a wonderful way of saying conferencing. And when we start to think about how do you really build in time for reflection, because it always feels like there's not enough time in the classroom. When teachers are conferencing or conferring with their students, that can be part of that conferencing model. So Chris shares some ideas, ways that he's used conferencing and conferring, and why he would not want to teach if conferring is not part of his practices. So let's take a listen to what he has to say.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Klosterman. I'm a secondary literacy consultant here at Grant Wood. And here I get to talk about what I consider to be the magic sauce of any classroom. So to kind of take it from the 30,000 foot view, a lot of attention has been focused on finding the right screeners and the right diagnostics and progress monitoring and all of that. And it has its place. And what those are trying to do is to try to figure out where students are at in their learning. And for us as educators to be able to backfill any of the gaps that might be there. And so there's nothing wrong with that. But what I'm also here to say is that the real magic sauce to doing all of that work is in conferring and being able to have a conversation with students and being able to engage them with not only their own learning, but with you as a teacher, so they understand where you're coming from and why you're doing what they're doing, and for you to build a relationship together that's centered around, all right, here's what I know and here's what I want to learn next. So you're going to hear the phrase magic sauce over and over again, but to be also clear about that metaphor, It is just as messy as it sounds, so one of the things that I joke about, but I'm also very truthful about, is that especially at the secondary level, when you've had students who haven't had a lot of conferring experience, and they've had a lot of what I would call institutionally bureaucratic things happen to them that have kind of put them on the conveyor belt, but haven't kept alive that desire to learn and to see what's around the bend again. You kind of have to warm them up a little bit. So for those of you that are just trying conferring for the first time in your classes and you're dealing with a lot of awkward silence, I'm here to tell you that's a good thing. Awkward silence in the teenage years is there to tell you that you're doing it right. But I've also learned from experience, not only in my own classroom in the past, but then also working with teachers, is that once you do have students who are very comfortable with conferring with you as the teacher, it is kind of, the the opposite problem becomes more prevalent, where you're kind of having to rein them in, so to speak, that, they are sharing so much that you are just trying to kind of find your own foothold to be able to give them some feedback that they can use. And you've got to get to the next student, and there's going to be a pep rally at the end of this period. And so, the process is that when you begin the conferring process, when you're talking with a student, what you want to do is first find something that they have succeeded at, but it's something that can be celebrated. It can be something that you have noticed about them and even their work habits that you appreciate. You want to mark these students as being unique in your classroom, that you can tell them, hey, I've noticed about this about you that I've really liked. I like how your brain works in trying to untangle these particular concepts. And we're looking for that kind of celebratory but authentic first win, so that their nervousness is brought down and they understand that you have noticed them, something good and something positive about them. So with that, then we can get into some of what they have brought to share. In a normal, conferring session, the student is learning something and wants to talk through their learning. You want to see what they've learned. And so now this middle portion is basically what you can give them as feedback, after you've heard their analysis or their thought process or the steps that they're on, or, maybe some of the hurdles that they've had and how they've overcome them and all of that. Now it's a chance for them to get absolute individualized feedback from you quickly and efficiently through just a natural conversation. That can be very, very valuable. So that feedback back to them to equip them, for the next steps is vital. And that last portion of a conferring session is, I've heard the term, glows and grows, but for me, I love the metaphor of the long and winding road, especially when we're talking about humanities courses, where you can't just bottle up learning to just high school or just ninth grade. For example, in writing, I'm a better writer now than I was when I was in my 20s. And in my 20s in college, I was a way better writer than when I was in high school. And in high school, I passed all my classes. So I had something going on, but I knew it was a progress. I knew it was a process, and that's okay. So it's good for us to help with our students understand that, okay, at this time right now, here's where I see that you're at. Here's the evidence that you brought. I think this is excellent. Here's where the path generally leads. Here's where we're going to go as a class, but then even beyond, here's where I can see somebody with your skill set going. Here's where you would apply this. Here's why what you're doing on just an ordinary Tuesday in October could actually be planting seeds that you'll use further down the road in your life. It can be just like that. But what you're trying to do is to help them see around the bend. Just as the word assessment is derived from the Latin word to mean to sit beside, that's what conferring really is. We're sitting beside the student, shoulder to shoulder, and saying, here's where I've seen you. You have shown me where you're at. We've been able to problem solve anything that we can together, authentically together, and I can show you a little bit further down the path. And that is a win on any given day, regardless of the week or the month. So that would be kind of the loose process of conferring. So that brings up like the natural question of like, all right, Chris, you've spent your life in the humanities, in ELA and social studies, but like, what about math and science? What about ag classes and home building courses? Like, can conferring work there? And the answer is a resounding yes. A couple of things that you might lean on to help those conversations go more authentically and organically embedded into that world is looking at evidence, didactic evidence of learning, and then doing something what I call a supposition, where you're changing a variable. So when we talk about evidence, what we're saying is, okay, so let's say we're in a math class and a student shows they're thinking through a problem. What evidence is telling you that this is the right process? How does your brain handle or work through this logical sequence? When we're talking about like labs and lab reports, that can be a conferring session as well, where you can say, all right, what was the evidence that you found with this experiment? What does that tell you with your thinking going forward, and what might be happening next? But then when we talk about supposition, that can be where we change a variable. So, let's say you're in a woods class or you're in a home building class and you've used a certain technique for framing a certain structure. So then the teacher in a conference with a student can say, all right, so what if we change the structure a little bit? What would you change about your framing technique? What have you learned that would help you be able to problem solve for that new situation? So I lean a lot on John Almarode's work with student engagement, where he talks about like the 3 levels of engagement being emotional, cognitive, and behavioral. Mm-hmm. And that emotional is the most important. Well, you can create an emotional connection very easily through conversation. So what has your prior experiences been? Let's say in English, what are you coming in with? What do you enjoy to read? Have you ever written something for fun? And then what questions do you have? What would you like to learn in this course? What can I help like personalize for you along those lines? So that itself can be a progression of, we're going to go and set up kind of that teacher-student relationship of trust through conferring. And then we can get into the cognitive engagement as we move into deeper waters in the course. And the behavior comes right in suit with that, because then they know what to expect from you, and they even know how conferring works as they continue to get used to it. Again, I can't espouse it enough. It is truthfully like the hinge pin for me in education, that if you were to say or somehow outlaw, teacher-student conversations, I don't think I could be in this profession anymore, because I don't think I could teach, anybody anymore. It is messy. It is something that, it takes some very active listening and some very kind of what I call cognitive quick twitch muscles to be able to then say, okay, so what would be the next right step? Once done, like, just sit back and breathe easier, that not only do your students know that they know something, that that they know something, and that they're prepared for the next steps.
Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing your experience with us and your understanding of conferring. Thanks for your work with teachers and students.
So our next, the third practice in this tenet is that students have the opportunity to provide the teacher with input and feedback on learning experiences. So when you read that practice, what comes to my mind first is incorrect. And that is, at the end of a college class, when you you fill in the little feedback form for the college professor to tell them how they did. That's not what we're talking about here. This is not feedback that is focused on the teacher. Instead, this is really a way of having a student think about the learning and giving feedback for how that learning interacts with them. So if you think about a student's day, like all day long, they're taking in new content about or practicing with content to grow their understanding and their knowledge in different content areas. Well, this is a time for them to take a step back and think about not just what they learned, but how they learned it. It's the metacognitive reflection that is really thinking about not the what they learned, but how they actually did that. It's really important to point out that this isn't the teacher. It's not about the teacher doing the teaching. It's for the student. The purpose of this feedback is for the student to really think about how they learn and how they learn best. The focus is always on the student in this practice. So Gina has some examples of ways that this could live in our classrooms.
So as Beth said, again, the feedback that we're collecting from students is very much focused on like the learning experience that they just had. And so it's not like some sort of a summative, like, this is how I felt about you as a teacher at the end of the class, or this is how I felt about this class at the end of the class. But rather, let's think about what are the things that we are doing to learn in this class, and how could we possibly tweak those or change those, or think about what's happening in a way that might make that next experience better for me as a learner. And so an example of this might be a lot of teachers who are engaged in blended learning or personalized learning, they utilize video in their classrooms. And a lot of times, instructional video, I should say, a lot of times students will say, oh my God, I hate video so much. I can't stand it. I don't learn anything from it. But they don't really think about like, what are the things that they as students are doing that help them learn from the video or that hinder their ability to learn from the video. And so giving students just a little bit of space to think about, okay, video is here to stay. It's not going away. We are going to use instructional videos. What are some things that could be tweaked with the videos to help you learn a little bit better? And so students might start thinking, like actually the first 4 minutes of the video, I'm pretty engaged and I'm getting a lot out of it. It's just when it starts getting to be like 7, 8, 9 minutes long that I really have a hard time continuing to focus. And so maybe a piece of feedback I might give my teacher is that the video length could be a little bit shorter. Also, like I don't always have an opportunity to apply what I've learned in the video right away. So having some sort of a check for understanding where I have to maybe watch part 2 of the video to see if I understood what it was that was being taught to me would be a good way to do that. And a way that we could really quickly just incorporate that into the classroom structure is have that be part of an exit ticket. So have students take out, a piece of paper, pass out a note card to them at the end of the day and be like, hey, we had a video today. I want you to answer these 2 questions. 1, how was the length for you with this video? Too short, too long, just right? Give me a little feedback around that. 2, how did you feel your understanding was in this video? Was there a place where you would have benefited from some sort of like check for understanding or apply what you learn right away? And have them provide some feedback around that. Another way that you can collect that kind of information from your students or have, a little conversation around that is to have a class debrief. So reserve like the last 5 minutes of a class period or the last 5 minutes of a lesson if you are an elementary teacher or a literacy block of time or whatever, and have the students just reflect out loud with you about what was working today and what might need to be tweaked. So for example, let's say you're like introducing a new thinking routine and they're working on that with partners, or they're doing something with partners. Having them think a little bit about, okay, so what worked with that thinking routine for me? Like, how did I understand it? How did it work? And what, might I tweak, or what might need to be done a little bit differently next time for me to really benefit from it? Would be a great way for them to just reflect upon how they're best learning, and for you to hear, okay, here's a couple of things that I could do to maybe tweak this experience for the next time around, and make it go a little bit more smoothly for all of my students.
Awesome. Thanks, Gina. As we really think about this tenet of students as self-directed learners, we hope that it starts to turn on a light for you to really think about your students' role within your environment, right? So students have a super important role, and I feel like all of the tenets feed into that, but specifically this one really invites them into the process fully through goal setting, reflection, and feedback. And as we amplify their voice in our own classroom, we know that they will see themselves more in their classroom, and they will see themselves as learners and not just a student in a room, right? They have the most important role in your classroom, and we need to give them permission to be an active participant in that, an invested participant in that, an engaged participant in that. And through some of these strategies that we went through today, hopefully that can give you some stepping stones to empowering your students in that way. So as we round this out, especially this one, don't forget to put the person in personalization.